In 1969, the Supreme Court ruled that a public school forbidding students from wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War was a violation of the First Amendment rights.
So how does a seemingly subtle act of protest result in such a momentous decision? And on what basis was the case decided? This is the story of Tinker versus Des Moines.
In 1965, Americans were divided in their support of the Vietnam War, with protests sprouting nationwide.
In Des Moines, Iowa, a group of students led by 15-year-old John Tinker, his sister Mary Beth, and their friend Christopher Eckert quietly carried out their own act of protest by wearing black armbands to school.
The school district prohibited the armbands, threatening suspension or expulsion if the students didn't comply. The Tinker family, active in civil rights and anti-war movements, were committed to protecting free speech and took the school district to court.
After the district court ruled against the Tinkers, the case was brought to the United States Court of Appeals, which resulted in a tie. The Tinker family would make one final appeal in 1968 to the Supreme Court.
With the lower level courts divided, how would our highest court come to a decision, and what would it mean for the Tinker family and other American students?
Attorney Dan Johnston took on the case for Tinker, arguing that the school district's armband policy was unconstitutional and violated the students' First Amendment rights.
He also maintained that since students have been granted constitutional protection of the right to symbolic expression in schools in the 1943 case of West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the same reasoning should apply to the students' use of their armbands.
Opposition to the case was firm, arguing that the students' decision to wear the armbands was a disruption to the school's duty to maintain order, so much so that it outweighed their First Amendment rights.
The interpretation of the Constitution had been debated and a major decision was underway. Do First Amendment rights disappear when a student enters a public school?
According to the Supreme Court, that answer is no. The 7-2 count came with Justice Abe Fortas writing for the majority.
Fortas wrote that teachers and students, quote, do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate.
Fortas further argued that student expression cannot be suppressed when it doesn't interfere with school discipline.
The dissent maintained that the Tinkers' behavior was a disruption, a sentiment echoed in future cases.
In 1986, the Supreme Court ruled that a student could be legally suspended for lewd speech. And in 1988, the court decided that it was within a school's power to censor student newspapers.
Turbulent political times often inspire protests, especially among passionate young people.
What will next test the limits of free speech and result in a Supreme Court controversy? This was the story of Tinker versus Des Moines.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Hughes History as we try to wrap our heads around another Supreme Court case. This time we're going to go back to 1986 to take a look at the court case Bethel School District versus Frazier and take a look at the constitutional rights students have within those walls as it relates to freedom of speech. If those walls could talk. But the Supreme Court certainly is going to talk right here, so why don't we go giddy up for the learning and go see if we can't get her done right now. So why don't we first take a look at what actually happened. So we're going to go to Pierce County in Washington State. The year is 1983, and we have a young man, a spirited lad. His name is Matthew Frazier, and he's a senior in the Bethel School District. And he wants to nominate his friend Jeff Coleman to be vice president of the student body. And luckily for him, there's going to be a voluntary assembly where he's going to be able to do that, which he does. About 600 students, mostly 14-year-olds, pile into the auditorium. And now Matthew's going to make his great speech. And I'm warning you, it is a double entendre. Awkward. And it certainly was awkward in the auditorium. Guidance counselors reported that students were embarrassed. Some students were mimicking the speech. Others were giving obscene hand gestures, but everybody knew in that room what Matthew Frazier was referring to, including administration. So he's going to be called down to the office and he's going to be given a 3-day suspension. A 3-day suspension and also a ban from speaking at the school's graduation, which he had planned on doing. So he is basically told that he has violated the school conduct policy, that any type of behavior that substantially interferes with students' education, including the use of obscenity, whether it's in language or gesture, is going to be a problem. And furthermore, Matthew had shown his speech to a few teachers, and they warned him. They said, "Not a good idea, Matthew. You're going to get in trouble." So he does get in trouble. He takes the 3-day suspension. He actually admitted that he knew what he was doing, and then he comes back after 2 days. But in the vote for speaker at graduation, he came in second, even though his name was crossed off the list. His peers wrote him in, but he's not going to be allowed to do that. So those are the facts of the case. And now Matthew's parents think there's a constitutional issue. Why don't we take a look at that right now? So they're going to sue the school district based on the idea that Matthew's First Amendment freedom of speech was violated, not only by getting in trouble for giving that speech, but also because he was banned from speaking at his future graduation. So they bring in the 14th Amendment. No state shall deny its citizens all this life and liberty stuff without due process. Matthew wasn't given due process, so therefore this is an unconstitutional act by the school, and they win the district court case. They win the appeal, and he is awarded monetary damages for this slighted liberty that the school district has given him. But now it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and we have the last vestiges of the Burger Court. Warren Burger is Chief Justice. This is one of his last decisions, and this court is known as being a right-leaning court, much more moderate than the former Warren Court, certainly. So let's take a look at the decision of the Burger Court. Who are they going to side with? They're going to side with the school big time. Now, they bring up the idea of Tinker, and we all should say it out loud. Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969. This is a court case that students won, but they were wearing armbands. That was symbolic freedom of speech, their opposition to the Vietnam War. Students have that right. But the court says that this is different. And while we do grant adults the ability to use offensive language in terms of communicating ideas, certainly we don't expect schools to give students that same latitude because they're on a mission. Not only are they on an academic mission, but they're on a value mission. And the school student discipline policy was very clear that any obscene language was going to come with a consequence. And he knew that. They say, "Matthew, you knew that. People had told you, teachers had told you were going to get in trouble." So number one, we have to give school boards the latitude to come up with language which is going to be able to be broad enough to deal with unseen actions. Nobody knew that this was going to be something that was going to be done. Berger says that criminal code is one thing. You have to be detailed in the criminal code. But when it comes to school code, we can have more broad language to give schools the ability to deal with these unseen actions that students are going to do. And in terms of the 14th Amendment and due process, that's poppycock, hogwash. You knew exactly that using obscenity, and you knew this was obscene, was going to have consequences, and you were told by teachers. You bringing up this idea that your liberty was somehow stomped on is just nonsense. So this is a huge win for schools across the country and their ability to regulate student conduct as it relates to freedom of speech in school. So if you want to say something and you're going to think this is my freedom of speech, and it's going to be racy or dicey or offensive, the school's going to have the ability to crack down on you. Now, not all of the judges are thrilled with this decision. We do have Thurgood Marshall and John Paul Stevens that are going to write a dissent where they're basically going to say, "I will always err on the side of freedom." Yeah, but that's going to be a losing proposition right here. So we certainly hope that you understand the basic constitutional issues and ideas behind Bethel School District versus Frazier 1986. Burger, go, go, go! What are you going to do? All right, guys, so that's all I got for you. Make sure that you haven't subscribed, you do that because it's the right thing to do. And I'm going to say it because I say it at the end of every lecture that I've ever given. Where attention goes, energy flows. We'll see you guys next time that you press my buttons.
We've learned that public school students possess First Amendment free speech rights at schools. In the Barnett and Tinker decisions, the United States Supreme Court protected the right of public school students to opt out of the Pledge of Allegiance and to wear black peace armbands at school. However, in the 1980s, the United States Supreme Court cut back on the amount of student free speech protection. One of those decisions was Hazelwood School District versus Kuhlmeyer. It involved the ability of school administrators to censor speech in a student newspaper if the school principal felt that articles in the newspaper were inappropriate. At Hazelwood East High School, Principal Robert Eugene Reynolds was upset at two articles that appeared in the edition of the paper. One article dealt with the impact of divorce upon teens. Another article dealt with teen pregnancy. Principal Reynolds simply felt that those articles were inappropriate for a student audience. 3 students, including lead plaintiff Kathy Kuhlmeyer, objected and felt that their First Amendment rights were violated. They contacted the ACLU and they filed a lawsuit in federal court. That case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Writing for a 5-member majority, Justice White wrote, quote, "Educators do not offend the First Amendment by exercising editorial control over the style and content of school-sponsored expressive activities, as long as their reasons for doing so are reasonably related to legitimate pedagogical or educational concerns." Essentially what this means is that school officials have broad power to censor school-sponsored student expression as long as they can come up with a legitimate reason for doing so. Many free speech advocates feel that the Hazelwood's decision gives too much power to school administrators and provides too little freedom to public school students. That partially explains why an anti-Hazelwood movement arose, where different states have passed laws that provide greater free speech protection to students than the United States Supreme Court offered in the Hazelwood decision.